Before I go any further, I've got to dismantle this diaphragm mechanism here at the back, which of course doesn't want to move at all. That's well stuck, and clean this and reassemble it. Now on later shutters there are cutouts here so that you can remove the screws that hold the settings lever to the back of the aperture mechanism, the diaphragm mechanism here. In this case you can't, this is an earlier shutter, so that means it's slightly more complex to assemble. We'll take those 3 screws out. Are they all identical? They are. Later shutters, one of the screws is countersunk. Take that plate off. There's our blades. Now they didn't come out all stuck together. They were not stuck. They weren't stuck with oil, but the lever still doesn't want to move. So this is stuck. So if we remove the screws from this, we'll see if we can discover why. It may be that the lever's been bent, and so that there's an undue amount of friction between it and the case. If this was a rigid bodied camera, I might suspect that the camera had been dropped on its nose and that the mechanism was stuck because it was dropped and it collapsed. There was nothing obvious there. We'll clean these components and put it back together and see what fails to move. So all I'm using is some naphtha on a cotton bud. And our problem doesn't appear to be inside the case. It was at the back of the case possibly that lever didn't want to revolve. I'm not seeing anything particularly obvious there. Certainly no corrosion. Yeah. Nothing particularly obvious there either. So I'll put this plate back in the shutter. We'll put the lever back on and see what we see, if anything. I haven't put anything in here to lubricate this at the moment. I shouldn't need to see what's going on. It's one screw in place. Well, that lever moves. I have to say it's quite stiff, unusually so. Now there's always some distortion in the setting rings at the back of these things, and it's there by intent. It's to provide some friction between the lever and the case so that the aperture setting doesn't get accidentally, if it's too loose you'll accidentally knock it and you'd lose your setting. So it's possible that this ring is bent too much, that there's too much distortion there. That doesn't appear too bad. Well, it's tighter on this side. See if those screws are tight. They are. That doesn't feel too bad. It's there's more friction there than I would normally expect. And I think it's here. Yeah, that's certainly bent down a bit. Well, it's both sides really. We need some drag there, but not as much as we've got. The settings lever is certainly quite springy. I don't know how you go about causing that to be a problem. I wonder if you forced this down, whether that would distort it enough to cause this problem. I'll just keep working on this until I get. Oh, that's much better. That's smooth. Yeah, the pointer here drags on the case. That's bent funny. I'll square that up and see how we go. So the angle of this pointer here is funny. You can see that we've got an angle at this point, and then it comes out and goes up, and I suspect that this should have been flat in a plane with this, and then that was more at right angles. So I'll try squaring that up and see how I get on. Well, I'm happy with the feel of this action now. This seems to move smoothly. It's not unduly loose. There's no undue drag there either. That appears to be fine to me. So what I've got to do is clean the retaining plate and the diaphragm blades, and then set to reassemble the diaphragm. Now these blades are not symmetrical. The pin at one end of the blade is closer to the middle of the blade, and at the other end it's closer to the outside edge. That's important to note, because if you mix them up or put them all in the wrong way, things don't work right. So I'll clean these bits and then reassemble the diaphragm. I haven't finished cleaning the shutter entirely, but I put it back together again to check the function of some of the components. And the shutter does work now, but I was struck by how stiff the shutter speed adjustment was. And it just seems unusually tight. But when I look at it, I'll get this in the light so you can see it. Here, this plate's all buckled up. It's been damaged in some fashion. I suspect, of course, that with the speed train being jammed, that it's come to a stop at that position and someone has forced the shutter speed settings ring. So the ring itself here is damaged, and I'm going to have to try and straighten that out, because it means that this is unusually tight, and so it's awkward to change the speeds, and the way that's buckled up, I don't think it's interacting correctly with the retard gear train. The shutter does work. It'll run down quite smoothly on the slow speeds. The faster speeds are good, but there's certainly some problem here. I haven't polished those shutter blades yet, as you can see. I assembled the diaphragm, and basically at that stage I wanted to check and make sure everything was okay before I did the final assembly. I was concerned that the diaphragm was unusually tight, but it actually feels quite good now. That's really good. There's no problem there at all. That's nice and smooth. But I've certainly got a problem here with this speed ring that I'm going to have to deal with one way or the other. I'm quite confident I won't have a straight swap for this one, but I can probably knock that dent out. That distortion is just not right. Something is really it's really been thumped in some fashion. It must have been forced in some way, but I can't see exactly how someone's done that. Anyway, when I get that straightened out to my satisfaction, we'll try again. Well, that's been an adventure. I've been working on this shutter for well over an hour now, trying to get it working correctly. So there's a couple of things I wanted to try. One of the things I wanted to do was swap the speed cam settings plate because of the damage, the dents that were in it. It was misshapen. I don't have one that's exactly the same. So I was forced to straighten up the one that was in here, and that's revolving smoothly now. There's no problem there at all. But it did take a bit of effort. And of course I had problems with that retard gear train. The tag on it, there's an arm that sticks up on it which couples to the speed settings cam plate, and basically it swings the pallets into contact or out of contact with the mechanism to slow down the action of the retard gear train. The arm on that was bent. So the arm was bent, the area of the plate on the speed settings cam plate that contacted was bent, and of course the speed settings, the retard gear train itself had problems not wanting to run down at all when I'd started, and I had to go back in there and flush out the spring, the little hair spring that runs inside that retard gear train. Unfortunately, there was a drop of oil on it, and there was a drop of oil on it because I had used oil to lubricate that shaft, and that spring is akin to the hairspring in a watch. It's not as fine as that, but I could see this drop of oil was binding the coils of that spring, and so I was getting inconsistent timing as a result. So I had to flush that away with some solvent. The upshot of it is I've got a good working shutter, but of course I'm going to strip this down now because I want to clean those shutter blades. They're clean, but you can see the marks on them. They're just stains. They really need to be polished and brought back into a decent state. The diaphragm blades at the back, they have some markings on them too, but they're much less pronounced, and of course they're not visible from the front. And the diaphragm blades, there's no special need for them to be highly polished because they don't need to move at high speed, unlike shutter blades. So I'm not going to bore you with stripping down the shutter again. I will just clean those blades and put this back together. This has been a great surprise. To be honest, I expected this shutter to have nothing more than the usual oily blades. It turns out that wasn't the problem at all. So I have my shutter all back together, nice and clean, serviced, all the speeds run pretty good. The aperture moves smoothly and the lenses are clean. So the question is, how did it get into such an awful state? Well, starting with the stuck aperture at the back, I really don't have much idea what happened there. The blades certainly weren't stuck. The only thing that was stuck was the settings lever. It didn't really show any great signs of corrosion, but nevertheless it was stuck. There was some slight deformation in it, and straightened up. That certainly made it run smoother once it had been cleaned and put back together, but I don't really have an answer as to what had happened with that. It was just seized in place. Perhaps it was just exactly that. Perhaps the metal ring here had just seized to the aluminium centre. I don't know. And as for the shutter, well, that was damaged. I mean, there was damage in there. It was physical damage, and that can only have happened by someone doing something from either the outside or the inside of the shutter. The seized shaft in the retard gear train, that certainly is something that could have cropped up. Drop of moisture, anything's a possibility. Something caused that little tiny wheel on the retard gear train to seize to the shaft, and it was pretty well seized too. I've no idea what caused that, but that was certainly something odd. But as to the damage to the lever on the retard gear train and the speed settings cam ring, which was something like this, this is not particularly robust. It's quite deeply milled out there. There's various depths of cutout where it's supposed to run over and around things, and that's where it was all bent and buckled up out of shape. And how could you do that? Well, we know the retard gear train was stuck. I suspect that someone forced the shutter speed settings ring, either deliberately to try and unjam it, or they weren't aware that it was jammed and they forced it in order to move it to the speed they wanted to select. I don't know. But there aren't many inputs from the outside of the shutter that people can push and shove at. They've got the shutter release lever, they've got the settings lever, the aperture settings at the back, and the dial, the shutter speed settings dial. Now, I suspect that dial was twisted. I think someone rotated that when it didn't want to move, and basically in doing so they drove it up and over stops that were in the shutter, and that buckled up that plate. And after that, that plate was unusually stiff, and it's hardly surprising because it was unusually distorted. But the speed retard gear train seems to be working nicely, shutter behaving itself. I think that's fine, and to be honest, my only other alternative would be to swap the shutter to something else. I'd rather not do that. If you can recover the original parts and make them work again, that's by far the most preferable way to go, particularly when you're dealing with a camera which is 80 years old. So my next investigations will have to be with the camera body. Well, the fun continues. I did get the shutter back in there eventually. I couldn't understand why the retaining ring, I couldn't seem to get the tool to engage with it properly. It just kept jamming up. Well, it turns out that this thing has been well chewed up. There's a great big gouge out of it there which stopped the tool from engaging in it in order to tighten the thing up, and much the same on that side. So I've had to replace the retaining ring. Fortunately, I was able to find one that would do the job nicely, and it's enabled me to get the shutter back on the camera, which is useful. Now with a working shutter, I can just go through the process of using the camera as it would have been intended to be used and make sure that all the functions work. I've already identified some problems. I know that the focus helical needs to be stripped and cleaned, re-lubricated. That doesn't look to be complicated to me. I think that should be quite straightforward. At the top of the camera, some of these levers are very, very sticky, and they'll certainly need to be stripped and cleaned. Fortunately, I've downloaded the instructions for the camera, so I know, well, I will know exactly how everything is supposed to function. But that's it for today. I've got other tasks to be getting on with. At least I've got through what I hope was the worst part of this particular job, and hopefully it'll all be plain sailing from here on in. I think I've said that before. I'm back to this Kodak Duo 6-20, the shutter I've serviced, and I've put it back in here, and I've discovered that actually there's a lot of problems with this camera apart from the shutter, and the main thing is the film advance never appears to lock. It's supposed to automatically lock when it gets to the next frame. That doesn't appear to happen. The roller here is very, very stiff in its action, the one that would track the film through there. And the shutter release itself, that's exceptionally sticky. When you do get it to push down, it doesn't want to come back. So I'm going to have to take the top off the camera now and start investigating the mechanics under the top here, because I don't believe there's anything at the bottom of the camera for me to have to deal with. Now with this camera, someone has been in recent times, and so hopefully things aren't tight. No, the shutter, the film advance knob comes off. You certainly just unscrew that opposite the direction of the arrow, quite easy. The shutter release knob unscrews. That's a similar design that you're probably familiar with, something like that from the early Retinas. They had a shutter release button that's screwed in from the top. And the top cover itself, I think we're just held in by the strap lugs. I'll try unwinding those. Yeah, and that one's loose anyway. And the one at the other end is too. If they weren't, you just put a screwdriver through them and use that as a lever. Right, if I lift the top off, will anything happen? Well, will the top lift off is the first question. No, I've still got a small screw at each end of the top cover. That one's very chewed up looking. And that is quite like an early Retina too in that regard. This one's a bit unhappy looking. Oh, it's going to undo. Now, what have we got under here? Okay, so our top cover. Nothing particularly of note there. I don't know how that viewfinder is constructed. It doesn't matter, I can get to the glass surfaces to clean them easily enough. Now there are ports in the top cover here, covered by that back plate. There are two here and here. Though I don't see how they would get me anywhere useful. And there's certainly a port on the top here which would allow access here for horizontal adjustment of the rangefinder. Interesting. I suspect that the fact that there are ports at the back here probably meant that in an earlier example, perhaps the prototypes, there was an adjustment there for horizontal, vertical alignment or horizontal alignment right at that end. But regardless, that's all we need to know about the top cover. The frame counter disc, that lifts off. There's a pin on the bottom of this frame counter disc which engages with a hole in this little gear. I'm seeing if that gear will lift off. It does. and underneath it it's got a spring. This is our shutter release mechanism here. There's obviously an arm here which blocks that from releasing, but that is all very sticky. And that would be set by the film advance coming round and presumably stopping there when it's ready to wind on to the next shot. But as you can see, that is very reluctant to move. At this end, there's a button here that shifts this mechanism, and it would push that forward from wherever it happens to be. I think this advances our frame counter. So the rangefinder, I'm going to have a look at this rangefinder. I'd like to remove the rangefinder from the top of the camera in one piece if it'll come, so that I've got that out of the way and it'll allow me access to these other mechanical parts which are exceptionally sticky. So I'll just pause while I investigate how this thing's held on. Well, the rangefinder mechanism is coupled to our focus mechanism through a point here on that arm. I don't immediately see any way of freeing that up. It may be that this arm is shaped like a hook, and if I undo the mounting screws for the rangefinder and flip it up 90 degrees, I may be able to unhook that. That's really about the only easy way I see at the moment. There may be a difficult way, which I'll be forced to find. So there are at least two screws here which probably only hold the rangefinder in position. So I'll remove those. There may be a third screw which is doing double duty and is holding some other component on the rangefinder as well as holding the rangefinder body down. There is. Now, which one is it? This one really looks like an adjustment. Have I got any movement? I have. And we're pivoting about which point? It does look like that screw there might have to come out. Oh, I'll have to be sure of that, because that certainly looks like an eccentric, which means it will shift things if I move it, so I'm less than enthusiastic. No, that's not it. Oh, it's going to take some more poking and prodding to figure out this one.